steel-built radar base emitted a series of terrifying creaks, the ceiling visibly sagging downward. A transparent monster large enough to cover the entire building had, at some point, latched onto the roof above us, squeezing the entire base as if it were food. In the pitch darkness, a transparent tentacle as thick as a thigh suddenly shot out, tightly wrapping around my ankle and yanking me violently into the depths. As I was dragged across the steel grating, the screech of my boot tips scraping against the metal was sharper than gunfire. That iron-on-iron shriek traveled up from my feet, making my teeth ache. The thing dragging me had coiled around my left ankle. The thigh-thick, transparent tentacle tightened abruptly, like an industrial hydraulic clamp, squeezing relentlessly into the bone. The leather of my combat boots kept making noise, a faint, crackling sound of fibers snapping. My toes hadn't broken yet, but the pressure was steadily increasing, methodical and unhurried. Down the hallway, Thompson was slumped against the wall. His face was turned toward me, but his eyes were unseeing. A transparent substance covered his eyeballs, spilling from his eye sockets and already solidified. His features were completely sealed by the transparent material, like an insect trapped in amber. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered on and off. The diesel generator was still alive, electricity coursing through the deformed wiring, the hum rising and falling. As I was dragged past Thompson, my fingertips brushed against his sleeve. The fabric was coated in a thin layer of ice, feeling like the condensation on the outside of a refrigerated meat package. I slammed the heel of my left boot into the tentacle. The heel of a combat boot is the hardest part, and I put all my strength into the strike. It felt like hitting high-density plastic. The transparent outer wall cracked with hairline fractures at the point of impact. Then, within half a second, liquid inside surged to fill the cracks, and they vanished, restored perfectly. The dragging accelerated. I was pulled around the corner of the hallway, the side seam of my bulletproof vest scraping against a raised steel plate edge, tearing a gash in the nylon fabric. The door to the A-section stairwell was open. The stairs inside were in ruins, the handrails twisted like pretzels, the steel steps torn from their welds, each one warped in different directions. It dragged me upward. My spine slammed against every twisted steel step, the back edge of my helmet hitting the back of my head, my teeth biting my tongue, filling my mouth with the taste of iron. 3 floors above, the circular hatch leading to the radar dome had been forced open. The steel frame was bent inward, the edges densely covered with circular indentations, parallel spiral patterns, as if something had been pressed hard into it. Fragments of ice fell from above the hatch, landing on my face. I was being dragged into the radar dome. We had landed just 8 hours earlier. The C-130 had dropped us and the last batch of supply crates onto the ice sheet, the sound of its engines swallowed by the wind before it could fade. For people, 1 diesel generator, and a radar station supported by 12 steel columns, standing 40 meters high on the Greenland ice sheet. This place was ancient. The N/FPS-30 radar array had long been decommissioned, now operating under a civilian contractor's banner for ionospheric research. We were here for routine maintenance. Thompson was the first to notice something wrong. As a structural engineer, he immediately checked the displacement monitors on the support columns. Column B on the east side had shifted 7 millimeters. His tone was flat when he reported the numbers over the radio, but the data was off. A steel column drilled into permafrost shouldn't move. Mendez pried open the back panel of the server cabinet in the communications room. The wiring inside had been reconnected. The inner surface of the back panel was covered in parallel scratches, each spaced about 8 millimeters apart, all the same depth. He ran his finger over them, and his fingertip came away coated in something transparent, slippery, and stringy. Chun was in the power room monitoring the diesel tank. The fuel gauge had failed, but he calculated the actual consumption rate, and the numbers seemed normal. I found the first sample on the outer platform, a puddle of transparent gel on the steel grating in the northeast corner. I crouched down, and as my finger approached, the substance shrank back, avoiding my skin. I scraped a small piece into a sealed bag with my Leatherman, and it gathered itself into a ball inside. In just over 40 minutes, column B shifted from 7 millimeters to 14, then jumped to 31 2 hours later. The steel frame began transmitting a low vibration, inaudible to the ear but felt through the soles of our feet, a tingling sensation in our bones. We all thought it was the glacier squeezing the steel frame. After nightfall, Mendez suggested checking the radar dome. If diesel was being siphoned up there, it had to go somewhere. I led the way and he followed with a shotgun. We took the B-section stairwell. The steps weren't deformed yet, but with every step, we could feel the vibration rising through the framework beneath our boots. The hatch hinges were coated in the same transparent gel as the platform, piled around the pins in coiled layers, as if something had been coiled there. Mendez pushed the hatch open with the muzzle of his gun. It jammed at 1/3 open. The headlamp illuminated the back of the door. The steel plate was densely covered in spiral-shaped shallow grooves, the wave intervals so precise they seemed measured with a ruler, unlike anything human-made. Inside the radome was a hemispherical space, the radar frame still standing, its reflector mostly dismantled. Large sections of the acoustic insulation on the dome's inner wall had peeled away, revealing the steel beneath. A diesel pipeline ran along the base of the wall, connecting to a T-shaped diverter valve under the radar mount. Mendez held the back of his hand near the valve. It was hot, noticeably warmer than its surroundings. My headlamp swept across the center of the ceiling, where a circular tear marred the acoustic insulation. Its fibers frayed outward as if something had pushed through from the other side. The surface was damp, with traces of water that had frozen and thawed. Beneath the tear, a layer of ice had accumulated on the floor, opaque, milky white. At its center, a bulge rose, encasing something within. I crouched for a closer look. Light penetrated the ice, revealing the shape of a hand. Fingers splayed, each bent backward at an equal angle, palm facing upward, trapped 3 centimeters beneath the surface. Mendez whispered that the diverter valve was still pumping fuel, in a pulsed pattern, continuing upward. There was nothing above, only steel plates, acoustic insulation, and ice. Then the entire steel frame shuddered. This time, a metallic groan pierced the air, its frequency shrill enough to grate. The B-pillar displacement exceeded 40 millimeters. Outside, the steel steps in the stairwell emitted a sharp screech. 2 seconds, then sudden silence. Chun reported over the radio that diesel consumption had stopped. He calculated the total over 4 hours, equivalent to a medium-sized diesel engine running continuously above the dome. That was when it moved. The tearing sound from the dome's steel plate began directly overhead. A dull thud echoed from the roof, like a hammer striking sheet metal, pressing down and not lifting, holding firm. Large sections of acoustic insulation tore free from their rivets, crashing against the radar frame before bouncing to the floor. One rivet shot passed the left side of my helmet, striking the steel frame behind me with a brief spark before extinguishing. The tear was widening. The insulation ripped outward, exposing the steel beneath. The steel was deforming. I couldn't see what was pressing it, but the curved surface caved inward at its center, deepening like an invisible foot sinking into mud. Then came the first crack, lightning-shaped, splitting outward from the depression, its edges glaringly reflective. A second and third crack followed from different directions, weaving into a web. The steel bulge burst. The edges of the tier curled inward, jagged steel folding inward. Beyond should have been the sky, but no stars were visible, the light was blocked. Something transparent clung to the outside of the dome, pressing downward. Then the fingers reached in. Transparent tubes, thicker than arms, slid through the tear, lining its edges as they probed downward. They coiled around the torn steel, imprinting it with parallel, wave-like indentations. Press, pause, press again, rhythmic as a stamping machine. The first tubular tendril fully entered. My headlamp beam pierced its transparent outer wall, revealing a dense network of internal pipes branching from a main trunk, thinning to hair-like strands at the surface. Fluid pulsed within, synchronized. The exterior was covered in cilia, centimeter-long, needle-like hairs, thick at the base and tapering to fine points, all moving in unison. Those hairs swept through the air, searching for us. Mendez fired first. The Benelli M4 kicked in his hands, the shotgun pellets striking the nearest tendril. I saw the impact. The pellets sank into the transparent tissue like gel, their momentum vanishing instantly. Brief cavities formed inside, the surrounding fluid churning momentarily before the pellets lodged motionless. A ripple spread across the tendril's surface, extending less than a hand's width before smoothing out. The lead pellets remained embedded, their copper plating still glinting. The tendril didn't stop. It wasn't injured. It had absorbed the pellets. I opened fire. 3-round bursts, the impacts landing on the same tentacle's tip section, spaced 2 fingers apart. The bullets spun rapidly, drilling into the transparent skin and penetrating. They burrowed into the transparent skin, then jammed completely. I could clearly see the bullets struggling to tumble inside its body before finally coming to a complete stop. It severed 3 pressurized tubes, and liquid sprayed from the broken ends, forming a small, murky cloud within the transparent tissue. Then the severed ends sealed themselves. Muscle-like tissue writhed, pushing the lodged bullets outward. In 3 seconds, the bullets were squeezed out of the wounds, falling to the ground, coated in a layer of gel. The wounds closed. Mendez roared a single word, "Fall back!" We both retreated backward, keeping our eyes on the tentacles. He didn't stop firing, pumping round after round from his Benelli into the mass of tentacles while I covered him with precise bursts. Every bullet that entered was either swallowed or spat back out, unable to penetrate, unable to wound. More tentacles squeezed through the breach. I counted 12, maybe more. They extended downward side by side, covering 2/3 of the dome's inner wall, each over 12 feet long and still not touching the ground. They swayed slowly in the air, their surface cilia sweeping in wave-like motions, locking onto the positions of Mendez and me. My magazine ran dry. As I reloaded, I glanced down and saw the steel frame of the radar array deforming. 4 vertical steel pipes bent inward simultaneously, all buckling at the same point, 75 meters above the base with identical curvature, as if pressed by an invisible hydraulic press from above. There were no tentacles near the buckling points. It was empty. The pressure came from directly above the pipes. The same transparent body was crushing the steel frame from the top. It covered the entire dome above. The tentacles were its limbs. Mendez pulled out a flashbang. He yanked the pin and tossed it underhand. The timed fuse bounced once on the ground and rolled beneath the mass of tentacles. Explosion. White light scorched the entire interior of the dome, and the 162 decibel blast reverberated within the hemispherical space. I closed my eyes and opened my mouth, but my eyeballs still vibrated numbly in their sockets. When I opened my eyes, all the tentacles had stopped moving. Not a single one stirred. The wave-like undulations of the cilia ceased simultaneously, all turning in unison toward the flashbang's detonation point, like a row of sensors recalibrating. The cilia stood fully erect, needle-like hairs pointing straight outward like a row of radar antennas, locking onto us. Seizing the moment, I charged toward the hatch. Mendez followed close behind. As we ran past the radar array, I saw the steel frame had been compressed from above by nearly the length of a foot. The 4 pipes were bent at identical angles, and the points of contact with the transparent body above were indented, the bottom of the indentations flat, like the imprint of its belly. I squeezed through the hatch and Mendez followed sideways. As I closed the hatch, the hinges emitted that same crushing sound again. A new, deeper spiral indentation had formed on the inside of the door, perfectly aligned with the marks I'd seen before entering. The same tentacle, the same winding direction, had pressed again. By the time we retreated to the first floor, Thompson reported the displacement reading for column B over the radio, 73 millimeters. The rate had doubled. Chun reported the diesel flow had tripled, still directed toward the dome. Outside the first floor platform windows, a transparent layer clung to the exterior of the steel frame. Its boundaries were hard to discern against the night sky, but starlight refracted as it passed through. It enveloped the entire exterior of the radar station. I stared out the window. The surface of the transparent body was veined with pulsating tubes, fluid still pulsing within. The steel frame beneath our feet shuddered again. From above, the ceiling emitted the slow, grinding groan of steel plates being crushed, the sound advancing from a distance. Something wet and sticky slid slowly across the steel steps in the stairwell. All four of us crowded into the second-floor monitoring room. Thompson pulled up the displacement data for the support columns on the screen. Real-time readings for all 12 columns were fluctuating. Column B, 83 millimeters and still moving. Columns C and D had also begun shifting inward, though the displacement was minor, matching column B's early rate. He said this was a good sign. Uniform pressure, squeezing inward from all sides, meant the thing wasn't targeting us. It might just be treating the radar station like a reef or something to cling to, filter feeding. Once it realized there was no food here, it would leave on its own. Chun added that although diesel consumption had doubled, the total was still below 4%. Reserves were sufficient. He said the diesel was the attractant, cut off the supply, and the thing might lose interest. Mendez chimed in. After the flashbang detonated, it stopped. That meant it reacted to sudden light and sound, at least enough to know to avoid it. We could use that to drive it away. The three of them pieced together a seamless logic. A filter-feeding, transparent gelatinous organism had accidentally enveloped the radar station. It wasn't attacking people, feared sudden noise, and was likely drawn to the heat from the diesel. We could control the situation. The monitoring room gradually fell silent. The transparent tissue enveloping the exterior ceased all pulsations. The fluid flow in the pipes halted, and an overall stillness settled in. The sound of the wind vanished, blocked by the massive body outside. The space was left with only the low hum of the fluorescent light ballasts, the breathing of the four individuals, and the occasional beep from the instrument panels. I leaned against the corner of the wall, ejected the magazine, and reloaded. Pulling back the bolt to inspect the chamber, the extracted bullet was coated with a transparent residue, the copper jacket wrapped in a thin layer. I rubbed it between my thumb and forefinger. The texture was somewhere between silicone and jellyfish mucus, stretchy enough to form strands that didn't snap immediately when my fingers parted. Holding it to my ear, I gauged its temperature. It was warmer than skin, continuously emitting heat. It was still metabolizing. Even after being severed from the tentacle for so long, it was still metabolizing. At that moment, the transparent covering outside the platform window trembled. I was certain only I had seen it. The network of pipes within the layer outside the window pulsed simultaneously, all branches pushing synchronously from the bottom toward the dome, for 1 second, then stopped. Fell back into dead silence. Chun was in the power distribution room, preparing to remotely shut down the valve sequence for the diesel pumps. Mendez counted down for him over the comms channel. Thompson stared at the displacement readings, fingers poised over the keyboard. I opened my mouth to say, "Wait," but the words hadn't fully left my lips. Chun shut the first valve. The thing outside the window retracted a few inches. The transparent tissue pulled back as a whole, the pipe network shifting from a flat surface pressed against the glass to a three-dimensional web. The diesel flow stopped. A brief moment of quiet followed. Then the outside trembled again. This tremor didn't feel like a retreat. It was readjusting itself, shifting its weight elsewhere. In a corner of the monitoring room, an unattended instrument panel's needle jerked violently before snapping back to zero. It was the external platform's temperature sensor, reading -47 degrees, but the ice on the sensor's surface was melting. The contraction was a ruse. About 4 seconds after the diesel pumps were cut off, the fluorescent lights flickered violently and went out completely. The sound of circuit breakers tripping in the power distribution room echoed up from the first floor, a series of dull clicks traveling along the steel framework. Red emergency lighting flickered on, and the monitors went dark. Chen's voice crackled through the walkie-talkie. "Valve closure successful, diesel FL." The last syllable was swallowed by static, leaving only a hiss of noise in the channel. Then the steel framework beneath our feet began to scream. This time, the frequency escalated. A continuous high-pitched screech of metal under stress, rising from the first floor and resonating through the entire radar station's framework. Standing in the center of the second-floor monitoring room, I could see the grating beneath my feet visibly vibrating, a rhythmic low-frequency pounding. One thud, a half-beat pause, then another. The backup batteries powered up the support column monitor screens. Column B's reading exceeded 100 millimeters. Column A began moving too, its rate jumping from 0 to the same magnitude as column B. All the numbers were contracting inward. Pressure was squeezing in from all sides simultaneously. Thompson's hands flew over the keyboard, trying to pull up historical curves to analyze acceleration trends. But the screen flashed an error. The storage chip had locked up due to the power disruption. The display showed only real-time numbers jumping. No curves, no predictions. Each jump was larger than the last. Outside the window, the transparent body pressed against the glass. It was squeezing. Not even a sliver of space remained between the glass and the transparent tissue. The pipe network inside the body flattened against the glass surface. The fluid inside the pipes pulsed at least 3 times faster than before, the pipe walls visibly expanding and contracting radially with each pulse. The entire network resembled a hydraulic circuit with the throttle floored, operating at high speed in rhythmic surges. Each pipe wall stretched thinner than before, increasing transparency and revealing deeper branches pulsing at the same frantic pace. The glass began to bow inward. The first crack crawled from the lower left corner upward, branching as it went, each new fissure splitting again. The transparent body didn't relent, continuing to press inward, every millimeter of displacement grinding fine glass dust from the crack edges. The red emergency light caught the dust, filling the window with drifting crimson particles. Mendez repeatedly called for Chun over the walkie-talkie, but there was no response. The power distribution room was on the east side of the first floor, separated from the monitoring room by 2 levels of steel grating platforms. But now, the stairwell leading down was completely unlit. The red glow of the emergency lights stopped at the stairwell entrance, plunging everything below into darkness. Mendez said we'd go down to find Chun and reassess after regrouping. I take point. He instructed Thompson to stay in the monitoring room. The backup power could hold for a while, and someone needed to keep recording the displacement data. If the readings breached the structural safety line, he was to activate the emergency evacuation beacon immediately. The steel staircase was deforming. From above, each step should have been flat. Now, every tread was bending downward along its longitudinal axis, concave in the middle and curling up at the edges. The curvature was identical on every step. Weight from above was pressing down on the top of the stairwell, silently, steadily settling. The transparent entity had already seeped into the space above the stairwell, its sheer mass bending the steel plates. Stepping onto it, I could feel the steel compressing under my boots. With each step, the tread sank slightly before rebounding, the recovery uneven, sometimes more, sometimes less. The steel had passed its elastic limit. Any further pressure would cause it to buckle. The ground floor was worse than the stairs. The steel grating, originally flat, was now a rippling surface of peaks and troughs, the spacing matching exactly the arrangement of the transparent tendrils. Stepping on a peak, the welds emitted sharp, brittle cracking sounds. Some had already snapped, the grating held together only by its interlocking structure, barely keeping from falling apart. The situation on the ceiling above the first floor became clear under the headlamp's beam. The steel plates were densely studded with the roots of transparent limbs. Some were tendril-like, others resembled flat suction cups, and some were rod-shaped. Their forms varied, but they all grew from the same transparent entity, each pulsing in its own rhythm. The suction cups pressed against the steel, each contact point forming an inward depression. Shallow ones an inch deep, deeper ones large enough to fit half a fist. The door to the electrical room was open. The frame had been compressed into a parallelogram. The steel door jammed into the deformed frame. We had to squeeze through sideways. Chun was sitting on the floor, leaning against the main circuit breaker cabinet. His rifle lay across his knees, the barrel bent at roughly a 45-degree angle. At the bend, the metal surface bore uniform, concentric ring-shaped indentations. The front panel of the breaker cabinet in front of him was deeply dented. The texture at the bottom of the dent rippled, an imprint of the transparent limb, like the negative mold left by a stamping die on a product's surface. Chen's eyes were open, fixed on the tripped main breaker inside the cabinet. He had been trying to manually reset the breaker when the transparent entity compressed the cabinet. A transparent limb had reached in through the cable entry at the top, coiled around the breaker handle, and pressed down relentlessly, preventing him from pushing it up. The transparent gel around the handle had solidified in the air, forming an insulating seal that encased the entire switching mechanism. Chun spoke, his voice flat. It cut the power itself. It found the breaker, pressed it down, tripped it. It knows where the electrical room is, knows which one is the main switch. This thing understands power distribution. It cut off the generator, but in our pipelines, it had already laid its own blood-sucking vessels. Chun finished speaking, his eyes still fixed on the breaker. The ceiling of the electrical room sank another section. The machining texture on the overhead steel plate flattened under pressure, parallel crease lines appearing on the surface. As the pressure deepened, it emitted a sound like tin scraping, continuous, high-pitched, growing sharper. The entire steel frame was being compressed by hydrostatic pressure from above. The entity enveloped it from outside, applying synchronized pressure through every point where its transparent tissue had infiltrated. It was compressing the entire radar station simultaneously. The source of the sound overhead shifted. The entity was redistributing its mass, concentrating compressive force toward the eastern side of the first floor. Right above us, from the stairwell came the muffled sound of steel components being continuously pressurized. The transparent wall from above had already filled the space above the entrance and was extending downward. The way back, it had already blocked it from above. Thompson's voice squeezed through the radio, his phrasing still that of military communication, but his sentences fragmented. B-column displacement reading exceeds design limit of 190 millimeters. That number meant the permafrost around the B-column base had cracked, and the steel column was sinking into the ice sheet. The entire radar station's weight was now being borne solely by the column's elastic deformation. Before he finished, the next reading updated. The B-column status jumped from displaced to structural failure. The anchor points at the base of the column had been torn from the permafrost. The sound of the steel column separating from the ice layer traveled through the entire framework to the electrical room. A low, continuous, muffled roar of heavy steel dragging through the ice shell, as if something alive were howling beneath the floor. The ceiling overhead sank 8 inches all at once. The sound of plates tearing, welds snapping, and pipes bursting, all layered together in the enclosed space, indistinguishable from one another. The red emergency lights went out simultaneously. The backup power lines had been severed by the compressing steel frame. Complete darkness. So dark I couldn't even see my own gun muzzle. Then my flashlight flickered on. The white beam hit the ceiling, where the rippling creases on the steel plate were deepening. With every inch the crease lines advanced, they emitted a sharp, tin-on-tin scraping screech. Mendez reached out and tapped my shoulder, thumb pointing backward. We couldn't go back to the stairwell. He pointed his finger toward the back wall of the power distribution room, the maintenance passage. This passage had been left years ago to facilitate the replacement of diesel engine components, so narrow that one could only move sideways. At the end was the tool room, which had an emergency evacuation hatch leading to the external platform. The entity was pressing down on us from above, forcing us to move sideways through the passage. As Chun stood up, a loud snap of wires breaking came from the power distribution cabinet behind him. A transparent limb had crushed the insulation of the main cable, and the copper core was being severed strand by strand under the pressure. A spark flashed and then fizzled out with a soft pop. The generator had completely stopped. The silence and darkness pressing in around us felt as heavy as the entity itself. The three of us squeezed into the maintenance passage. It was just wide enough for our shoulders to scrape against both walls as we moved. The walls were bare steel plates, which should have felt cool to the touch, but some spots were hot. My fingers pressed against one area, and the temperature suddenly spiked by several degrees, only to return to normal when I moved slightly to the side. The locations of these hot zones corresponded precisely to the points where the transparent tissue was entrenched overhead. This monster was crushing us through the steel plates, and it was also feeding on the heat from the diesel. As I stepped forward, the ground beneath me sank. I shone my flashlight downward. The steel grating had been pushed up from below. The transparent tissue had already seeped beneath the floor and was applying pressure from underneath. We were inside something, completely surrounded. Mendez suddenly stopped. He turned off his flashlight and gestured for me to do the same. Complete darkness. Silence. The steel frame had stopped groaning. The pressure hadn't disappeared, but its rate of increase had slowed, as if the entity had shifted gears, from continuous compression to building pressure and readjusting its points of attachment. Then came another sound, rising from deep within the framework. An extremely low-frequency vibration, too low for the ears to discern a definite pitch, but my sternum felt it, my nasal cavity felt it, and the spaces between my bones trembled in sync. The rhythm of the vibration matched exactly the pulsating frequency of the pipes inside the transparent body earlier. It had surrounded the entire base station. All its tentacles were writhing to the same rhythm, slowly crushing the steel frame. Chen's breathing began to quicken. In that subsonic vibration, his chest wall was being shaken so violently that it mistakenly believed it was being compressed. A series of muffled, low sounds escaped his throat, and his hands began clawing at the wall. Mendez reached out and pressed down hard on his shoulder, suppressing the spasms. In an environment where everything was trembling, that hand became the only anchor. Then the hatch at the end of the tool room began to creak under pressure. The hinges snapped one by one, and fluid seeped out from the door seam. The bodily fluid of the transparent entity, injured by the hinges, solidified instantly upon contact with the cold air, forming a milky, semi-transparent solid that clogged the gap. But the door itself was bulging inward. The entity was pressing from the outside. The same was happening in the direction we had come from. The steel plate at the entrance of the maintenance passage was buckling inward, with ripples and folds pushing toward us along the surface. Both ends were squeezing toward the middle, like the peristalsis of an esophagus. We were inside its body. The entire radar station had been swallowed, and we were the half-digested lumps. Mendez turned his flashlight back on. The white light bounced back and forth in the narrow passage, illuminating the dust of insulating fibers on his face. He raised his left hand and quickly signed. Above, the pipeline entrance, a steel inspection cover measuring 2 meters by 2 meters, bolted to the ceiling of the passage. That pipeline carried the main cables, running directly from the second floor to the radar dome. It was wide enough for one person to crawl through. The entity hadn't occupied it yet. There was no diesel, no heat, and no open space worth compressing inside the pipeline. Chun looked at Mendez. The whites of his eyes reflected the flashlight's glow. His pupils contracted to pinpoints, but his eyelids showed no rapid blinking. He signed back. He would go last, providing covering fire from behind with his shotgun. I had to go up first to remove the bolts. Stepping onto the interlocked fingers of Mendez's hands, he pushed me upward. My fingers touched the bolts. Hexagonal heads, icy cold, covered in a layer of frost, but not yet coated with transparent gel. I unfolded the Leatherman, gripping the first bolt. The sound of steel grinding against steel as I turned it was sharp and piercing. With each rotation, the pressure from both ends of the passage increased simultaneously. The entity sensed our movement and began accelerating its compression. The first bolt came loose and fell into my palm. The second followed. Halfway through removing the third, my fingers froze stiff, and the Leatherman slipped from the hexagonal socket twice, rounding the bolt head. The fourth bolt was rusted into the nut, and when I applied too much force, it snapped, the broken piece ricocheting off the pipe wall with a clang. 3 bolts were enough. I pushed up the edge of the cover plate. The steel was icy and rough, and my elbows and shoulders trembled as I exerted force. The cover plate shifted, and decades worth of accumulated insulating fiber dust poured out from the pipe opening, covering my face. I shone the flashlight inside. The inner walls of the pipeline were dry, clean deep within, with no trace of the transparent tissue. I leaned my upper body into the duct, gripping the cable tray inside to support my weight while my lower half still dangled outside, my feet finding Mendoza's shoulders for leverage. Twisting around, I extended my hands headfirst to catch him. He locked onto my wrists and pulled upward. With his gear, he must have weighed over 200 pounds. My elbows were forced against the inner wall of the duct to distribute the strain, the pressure point right on the radial nerve. My forearm went numb. Couldn't let go. Just as his upper body squeezed into the duct, simultaneous explosions roared from both ends of the passage. The workshop hatch was completely crushed by one-way hydraulic pressure, steel fragments ricocheting off the walls and ceiling, sparks flying 3 or 4 times. At the same second, the entrance hatch breached its critical point. The center of the dented area tore open, and transparent flesh surged through the crack, filling a large portion of the passage. Chen turned below. The muzzle flash of his Beretta M4 turned the narrow duct into daylight, the blast echoing between the walls until all I could hear was a high-pitched ringing. The entity recoiled from the shotgun's impact, just for a moment. Chun stepped onto the rope Mendoza had lowered and climbed. He was lighter than Mendoza, but my arms were nearly spent from the earlier pull. When Chen's hand reached mine, my fingers couldn't hold. They slipped. Mendoza twisted around inside the duct, bracing his legs against the tray as an anchor, and leaned headfirst halfway out of the hatch, grabbing the drag handle on Chen's tactical vest. 3 seconds later, Chun was dragged into the duct. Looking down through the hatch, the maintenance passage was completely flattened. The floor and ceiling were pressed together, the narrow space we had just occupied gone. Transparent tissue compacted the steel plates, the sound of metal deforming, not a roar but a series of fine, crystalline cracks, one after another, unending. That was the sound of the creature feeding. A layer was being devoured alive. Mendoza stared at me from close range. His flashlight turned the insulating fiber dust on his face into white patches, his lips moving a few times. The ringing in my ears was too loud to hear him, but I read his lips. Radar dome. Core. Explosives. The only uncompressed space left was the dome. The radar dome was above the entity's center of mass. Its ventral side was there. A hydraulic digestive system with the core organ at the very top, dead center. We still had 2 grenades and a claymore. To kill this thing, we had to blow through its core from the inside. He repeated in hand signals, radar dome, core, explosives. Crawl upward. The cable duct was so narrow we had to hunch our shoulders to crawl. Elbows and knees scraped against the steel walls, the nylon reinforcement on my uniform sleeves catching on rough weld seams, leaving streaks of white fibers. Exhaled breath condensed into mist but didn't disperse. The air in the duct was dead, stagnant. Heat radiated from above, warmer than outside, an organic warmth like body heat. After crawling about 30 meters, Mendoza's flashlight beam halted ahead. It illuminated the duct exit, the inner cover of the radar dome access hatch. The ceiling gasket had long since deteriorated and fallen off, blue-white light leaking through the gaps. Bioluminescence. Mendoza removed the inner cover and peered out from the edge of the opening. He didn't move, then signaled with one hand, the radar dome is still there, but everything inside has changed. I crawled up beside him and looked out. At first, my eyes didn't know where to focus. 40 minutes ago, the radar dome we stood in was a spherical space of steel framework. Now, the entire inner surface of the dome was covered in transparent tissue, layered, the outermost layer pressed against the steel plates, inner layers differentiated into various structures. Tentacles hung from above, fleshy membranes stretched across the walls. Translucent vessels pulsed like living industrial cables, glowing mucus throbbing inside. The breach at the dome's highest point remained. Beyond it was Greenland's night sky, stars visible. But the starlight refracted and scattered through the layers of transparent structures, casting slowly shifting cold blue patches of light inside, like sunlight seen from underwater. The bioluminescence came from within the transparent tissue. Fluid flowed through the vessels, clusters of luminescent cells gathering at specific nodes, pulsing at a steady rhythm. The light was bluish-white, about as bright as a full moon through thin clouds, bright enough to illuminate the entire space clearly. The steel framework at the center of the radar array was mostly enveloped. Bent from above, the transparent tissue extended along the frame, covering every stress fracture point, as if absorbing the energy of the breaking process. The handprint molded ice layer on the steel plate below was already digested, gone, leaving only bare metal. The surface of the steel plate was covered in shallow circular indentations, identical to those seen earlier on the hatch but far denser, covering the entire floor. Then I tilted my headlamp upward and saw the entity's ventral side. Directly beneath the highest point of the dome, all the tendrils that had probed through the breach converged into a single circular disc about 4 meters in diameter. The bases of dozens of tentacles fused together, forming the disc, which faced downward and pulsed slowly. With each pulse, the transparent membranes hanging around its perimeter rippled in sync. From the very center of the disc, a central shaft, 2 meters long, descended. At its lower end, it split into 4 sac-like bulbous structures. Each sac alternately swelled and contracted, pulsing independently. During each pulse, the sac walls became more transparent, revealing the complete cycle of pressurized fluid being pushed forward, flowing back, and being pushed again. That was its heart, a massive hydraulic pump made of living flesh. Mendez aimed his flashlight beam at it. The Claymore mine, attached to the front of the highest remaining vertical steel frame of the radar array, facing away from the core, with a 60-degree blast arc, covered the entire ventral area of the hydraulic station. 2 grenades, pins pulled, their delay fuses secured with tape, were placed directly beneath the tubular sacs. The shock wave from the mine's detonation would trigger their secondary explosion. The detonation cord ran back to the pipe exit. We would initiate it from inside the pipe. Chun and I backed out of the pipe opening. Our movements were low and swift. The moment our feet touched the ground, we felt it. The surface was covered in a transparent biological membrane. It was soft, elastic, like stepping on hardened silicone. When we lifted our feet, the footprints slowly rebounded, accompanied by a faint sucking sound. The mucus was increasing adhesion, trying to slow us down. We reached the radar array. The remaining vertical support pillar leaned to one side by about 15 degrees. Its surface was completely sheathed in transparent tissue, slippery to the touch, hard to grip. I pulled out my Leatherman, wedged the blade into the gap between the pillar and the biological tissue as an auxiliary grip, and began climbing. With every upward move, the steel frame resonated with infrasound. The trembling in my arm muscles mixed with the vibrations coming from outside, making it impossible to distinguish fatigue from external force. At the top, I took the Claymore mine from my backpack. 3.5 pounds, curved convex shell, olive green. I flipped it over, opened the scissor leg stand, and inserted the detonation cord fuse. I faced the core. The hydraulic station disc was barely 5 meters away. The central shaft pulsed to its own rhythm, the pressure changes from each pulse creating intermittent breezes inside the dome, warm against my face. Chun worked simultaneously below. He secured the first grenade at the base of the left rear tubular sac, wrapping tape around and around where the sac wall met the pillar. The second grenade was symmetrically fixed on the right rear side. The safety levers on both grenades were still in place, reinforced with multiple layers of tape. With every wrap of tape, the sac pulsed, pushing his hand away, but he pressed on and continued. I climbed down, kneeling and shuffling backward on my knees, using my palms to press the detonation cord into the crevices on the membrane's surface. The membrane had irregular textures that could hide the cord. The cord was too thin. We had to ensure it wouldn't be snapped by the mucus during our retreat. Mendez waited at the pipe exit, handing me the end of the detonation cord. The detonator was a mechanical trigger. Squeeze the plastic handle, 3 kilograms of pressure, built-in spring firing, delay of a fraction of a second. All 3 of us retreated into the pipe, moving back at least 6 meters, clear of the fragmentation fan. I gripped the handle. My thumb pushed open the safety catch. Inside and outside the pipe, everything fell into absolute stillness. The hydraulic station's pulse halted in the expansion phase following its last contraction. The disc froze. The central shaft froze. All 4 tubular sacs simultaneously stopped in their swollen state. The flashing intervals of the cold blue light vascular network stretched, from once per second to 3 seconds, then to 5. The entity sensed the anomaly. It had detected us. It was waiting. I pressed the trigger. The instant the blasting cap fired, the detonation inside the pipe felt like a hammer blow to the back of the skull. The air compressed and expanded violently, eardrums instantly surpassing the pain threshold. The shrieking tinnitus drowned out all other sound. 700 steel balls scattered from the curved convex face at 3,000 feet per second. The transparent tissue in the ventral area of the hydraulic station was hit head-on. The transparent body within the blast arc instantly turned into a hollowed-out sieve. Each steel ball left a temporary cavity as it penetrated the tissue, clearly visible under the cold blue light. string of beads penetration trails, from the disk's surface deep into its interior, the trails narrowing as the balls decelerated, until finally the balls stopped, enveloped within the tissue. But the damage was done. The hydraulic tubular sacs began to collapse even before the secondary detonation. The perforations on the first sac tore open. The high-pressure fluid inside the sac finally erupted violently through the tear. A transparent liquid jet shot from the breach, hitting the transparent tissue covering the inner wall of the dome, splattering down the curved surface into a mist. As it sprayed, the sac wall continued to tear, the breach expanding from a hole to a crack, the crack widening into a gap where fragments flew away. The second grenade was triggered by the landmine's shockwave in that instant. Prefabricated fragments sliced through the sac wall from below, opening 3 breaches simultaneously. Luminescent fluid sprayed out from the openings, its range shorter than the previous one, but the flow far greater. The entire sac deflated after losing pressure, its walls crumpling into a mass, while the remaining fluid inside seeped out through the breaches, trickling down the outer surface of the tubular sac and onto the ground. The hydraulic station panel lost pressure support. Dozens of tentacles simultaneously lost pressure. The force of hydraulic fluid backflow vanished, and the panel began to descend. It was too heavy, and though the tentacles remained, their elasticity failed after the pressure loss, dragging the panel down slowly. The central axis tube snapped under the combined weight of the panel and gravity. The break point wasn't sharp. The tube stretched, tore, and finally separated, softly, like a fire hose ripped apart. The bioluminescence across the entire dome began to flicker. Tens of thousands of luminescent cells, deprived of circulating fluid, extinguished all at once. Patches of blue-white light shrank one after another, darkness devouring the dome from the edges toward the center, accelerating. The panel finally crashed onto the steel frame of the radar array. The combined weight of the panel and dozens of paralyzed tentacles slammed onto the already bent top of the steel frame. The support pillars emitted a final, twisting groan of surrender. The load-bearing columns could no longer hold. Accompanied by the deafening sounds of welds and rivets bursting, the entire steel frame plummeted downward by a significant margin. The tentacles lay piled atop the panel, no longer pulsing, no longer moving, utterly still. The interior of the radar dome plunged into complete darkness. The once overwhelming blue-white bioluminescence had vanished entirely, and the starlight leaking through the breaches in the dome was mostly obscured by the wreckage. In the darkness, only the 3 white beams from our underbarrel flashlights remained, intersecting on the still life tableau of transparent carcasses and steel wreckage intertwined. The physical core was destroyed. The transparent body enveloping the entire radar station remained, but its pressurization system had failed. Pressure at all attachment points gradually dissipated, and the steel frame was no longer being compressed. The anchor points in the permafrost had been destroyed, and the steel structure couldn't recover, but at least the crushing had stopped. Chun whispered, "The diesel stopped. Stopped. The hydraulic pump was destroyed. The entire circulation terminated." Mendez switched off his flashlight. 2 beams remained. Another beam went off. Only mine was left. The white light shone on the very top of the pile of transparent tentacle carcasses. Layers of paralyzed transparent limbs were stacked there, the tentacle walls having lost all tension, sagging limply over the steel wreckage. The last remnants of luminescent cells clung to the nerve endings of the transparent sac walls, emitting an extremely faint blue flicker, a final neural spasm before death. The blue light persisted through 3 flashes, then utter darkness. When we crawled out of the pipeline, the sky was still dark. Thompson was in the monitoring room. He was alive. The backup power was barely hanging on, and the display showed the entire displacement curve. After column B failed, the remaining 11 columns followed one by one, all recorded in the solid-state storage. The entire process lasted 124 minutes. Chen's left forearm had been crushed, the entire lower arm deformed and limp. He had used combat bandages to make a temporary splint, biting his lower lip without a sound, only the hiss of his breath escaping through clenched teeth. Mendez's right face had been grazed by shrapnel, blood smeared across half his jaw. secondary injuries from the Claymore steel ball bearings ricocheting inside the pipeline. He pressed his palm against the wound to stop the bleeding, refusing to apply a pressure bandage with gauze. He said to save it for worse. The rescue aircraft arrived 4 hours later. The C-130 had received the emergency evacuation beacon activated by Thompson before the power cut. Descended to the first-level platform to wait. The emergency hatch of the tool room had been crushed from the outside by the entity. After the entity died, the crushed section of its limb slid from the damaged hatch to the outer side of the platform, its translucent remains frozen onto the steel plate. Minus 47 degrees Celsius, bodily fluids froze into ice-like solids within seconds of contact with the air. I stepped over the remains as I walked out. The soles of my boots crushed them into glass-like shards, the sound identical to stepping on ice. Thompson set up an infrared signal lamp outside the platform. Flashing pulses shot into the night sky, each flash illuminating the surface texture of the surrounding ice sheet. Against the backdrop of a moonless night, green auroras hung low in the northern sky, vertical curtains of light utterly motionless. We sat on the permanently twisted steel grating. No one spoke. The steel frame beneath us still trembled. A low-frequency, persistent vibration rising from deep within the ice sheet, the column pit left after column B was pulled out. No one knew when the tremors at the bottom of that pit would cease, or when the ice layer would refreeze solid. The engines of the C-130 rumbled in from the southeast. The rescue basket descended. Chun went first, then Mendez, Thompson, and finally me. As we ascended, I looked down at the radar station. The red emergency lights were still on, no longer obscured by the translucent bodies that had once enveloped it. DYE-2's overall structure remained intact, but 3 of its 12 support columns were no longer vertical. They leaned inward, their bases sinking into deep pits where the ice had collapsed. The bottoms now a mirror-like surface of melted and refrozen ice, reflecting the red glow of the emergency lights. The breach on the radar dome was still there, the edges of the torn steel plate curled upward and encased in a layer of translucent ice. Frozen solid, the remnants of the entity clung to it like a massive, lifeless husk. The basket retracted into the aircraft. The hatch closed, the pressurization system activated, and the cabin lights flickered on. I kept my helmet on, leaning against the cabin wall. As I wiped the back of my hand across my left cheekbone, I felt something, a dry, transparent fragment stuck to my face. It was a frozen remnant of the entity. With a single swipe of my hand, the fragment shattered into pieces, peeling away from my face and falling onto the aircraft's non-slip deck. I stared at it. The deck trembled with the vibration of the engines, and the fragments trembled along with it, their edges catching the light from the cabin ceiling. Then it moved. It moved on its own, a single pulse. A faint blue dot flickered at its center for half a second. Then it stopped. It never moved again. I watched it until the plane touched down.